Good morning. Boy, that worked pretty well. My name is Margulies. I'm the Executive Director of MIT's Open CourseWare program. Welcome to MIT and to the Forum on the Economics of Open Content. Back in 2001, before the dot-com bubble had burst, MIT announced what was considered a very bold initiative called Open CourseWare. The idea behind Open CourseWare was to give away all of the educational materials from all of MIT's courses for free to the world over the internet. That bold idea came from the MIT faculty, but the idea was actually much bigger than just a website here at MIT. The idea was that others would do the same as MIT, and we would actually create a movement. That is a movement toward the open sharing of content for the benefit of all, a movement away from locking down educational materials so that they're only available to those who can afford to pay for it. MIT believes very strongly, and President Vest said this back in 2001 when it was announced, MIT believes very strongly in sharing educational content. We believe that it is one of the most powerful ways that we can help advance education around the world. And our current president, Susan Hockfield, when she talks about Open CourseWare, she talks about building a community, a global learning community in which ideas are shared openly for the benefit of all. Now, one of the reasons I think the Open CourseWare idea was particularly bold when it was announced was it was announced before there was a plan on how to pay for it. It was announced because the MIT faculty and the leadership had a very strong belief that it was just the right thing to do. And fortunately for MIT, shortly after it was announced, the Hewlett Foundation and the Andrew Mellon Foundation both stepped up to give us significant funding for the development of Open CourseWare. However, today, although in a nutshell, you'll hear more about this later, today it's very clear that we're going to reach our goal of publishing all of MIT's materials in just about 2 more years. It also appears to us that there is the beginning of a movement. It's less clear to us how we are going to continue to pay for and sustain this over time, which is why we're very excited that you are all here today. We're very excited to be part of this forum to talk about just that, to talk about how do we pay for something we're giving away for free. We have some ideas, and we'll share some of those later, but we certainly don't believe that we have the answer. I think certainly there are many more ideas that will come from many of you in this room. So thank you to Cathy and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for supporting this meeting. Thank you to Peter, who really did all of the work in assembling such an extraordinary group of people. And thank you to all of you for coming here to talk about these issues over the next 2 days. Cathy?
Good morning. Well, I'm delighted to be here, particularly with this beautiful weather. The snow isn't always possible for us to see it in California, so this is actually a treat for those of us who have crossed the country. I just want to say that the Hewlett Foundation is truly delighted to be supporting this Economics of Open Content Symposium. I want to thank Anne and her staff for hosting it here at MIT, and in particular to really thank Peter Kaufman, who has provided really the leadership and the vision for this meeting, who approached us with this idea about supporting meetings and exploration around private and public partnerships, and really to begin to push on these issues around how we begin to sustain this evolving field. Really, over the past 5 years, the Hewlett Foundation has developed a portfolio of investments around what we initially called open content and what we now call open educational resources. And our end goal has been to equalize access to knowledge, so knowledge can be distributed throughout the world in what we consider hopefully a more even way. The strategy has focused on supporting great examples of academic content and making them freely available to the world. As Anne mentioned, our first, she didn't mention it was a first grant, but our first grant in this area was to MIT Open CourseWare with its bold idea, where we partnered with the Mellon Foundation, and really just this idea about unlocking the course materials from Cambridge, from the very limited bounds of Cambridge, and the select few who get to attend MIT really to the world and to the world stage. So over the past 5 years, the foundation has gone on to support other types of content, OpenCourseWare being one, but we've gone on to support the dissemination of full courses, of learning objects, of library collections, and archives, because we wanted to test out what kind of content would be useful to the world audience, what is useful to teachers, to students, and self-learners throughout the world. And as we embarked upon really what we saw was the open content journey, we really got back into thinking about issues about access to the content, because it clearly wasn't sufficient to just put the content out. We began to invest in supporting projects around intellectual property rights, around technologies to help create the content and disseminate the content, and certainly been thinking hard about the cultural and translation issues as well as the localization of the content. If we build the pipeline of content, is that sufficient? How does it get localized and used on the ground? And how do we really begin to understand what the demand side is so that we can respond to the demand? So now, 5 years later, we've invested over $45 million in this effort. Countless other organizations, many of you who are represented here today, have invested tremendously also in terms of time and resources to really this emerging field. So now these new models of knowledge sharing, kind of the willingness to give it away, now demand new economic models for sustainability. So we see this as a collaborative process. We certainly welcome everyone who is here. We're delighted with the participation and the interest. We see this as a very timely symposium and just wanted to thank you for your participation.
I'd like to thank Anne and Cathy, and thanks to the Hewlett Foundation who have made this meeting possible, and not only have done so with great generosity and grace, but they have also made it possible for this meeting to be held at no cost, and by providing the resources to video record it to make it freely available to countless others who will be able to hear and see parts of it online. I'd also like to thank our generous speakers, 35 in all now, who are speaking today also for free. And thanks to everyone for coming to attend. Apparently we have a captive audience because of the snow. Many people here today have traveled a long way to get here. Friends have come from the UK. A friend flew in from Korea last night. Many friends from all over California are here. And folks have also driven, flown, and trained up from New York City, where our company is based and where Johnny Damon now plays. We have 35 speakers featured over 2 days. The meeting will kick off this morning with general reflections on new models of cultural production in the digital age, some analysis of the consumer marketplace where this has taken hold, and an extended rumination from Jim Sawicki on the new ethos of openness. And then it will move to and through a series of 17 panels over 2 days, covering open software, open courseware, open production methods for text, music, libraries and museums, film, television, and gaming. Because we have so many speakers with a range of lawyers, business people, etc., and 100-plus visitors expected to attend, we have to run a very tight ship. Speakers will have a maximum of 15 minutes of talk time. Q&A will take place after all speakers on a panel have finished. And this red button from Staples, which is not a corporate sponsor, will serve as a prompt.
That was easy.
Though a gentle one, that time has passed. We will also be obliged to dispense with the extensive and ponderous Brezhnevian introductions that are often featured at meetings of this sort. By Googling or otherwise searching for the accomplishments of our featured speakers, you will find that many of their writings and much of their work is available, and not coincidentally for free, online. The meeting will have 5 tiny opportunities where we can catch our breath for a second. 3 coffee breaks, dinner tonight, and then tomorrow morning at 8:30 during Cliff Lynch's talk as he reviews some of the highlights of what has happened today. I had proposed the title for Cliff's presentation, which is, "If Only We Knew Yesterday What We Know Today." It was the thing, to tell you the truth, that I was proudest of at this meeting. But Cliff responded that this title, while pretty solid, reminded him of a much better title of an old jazz tune written by Charles Mingus called "All the Wonderful Things You Could Be by Now If Sigmund Freud's Wife Was Your Mother." We could have another conference about that subject as a kind of follow-up to this meeting, and I'm sure that many of us here, especially some of the men from New York City, would have some interesting things to say about it. Your conference folders contain the program for today and tomorrow, bios for our featured speakers, and directions to our wonderful reception tonight, at which MIT's University Librarian Ann Wolpert will welcome us to the Frank Gehry building that is the Stata Center. Also in the folders is some material describing the achievements of MIT Open CourseWare, a beautiful flyer from MIT Press for new books on these topics, including books by several of our speakers, an article by Mark Cooper of Stanford Law School and the Consumer Federation of America. Mark is inviting comments on his paper, as he will tell you. And restaurant suggestions. Tonight's dinner is, to borrow a term, open, although after the reception this evening, a number of us will gather at the bar at some point tonight to try and put some closure on what promises to be a busy day. A number of us around the room are available to you if you need anything. Myself, my colleagues Mary Albin and Jeff Ubois, who have helped to make this meeting happen. Bathrooms are down the hall, and wireless is available in the lobby. Let me turn now to the substance of what we might hope to accomplish during these 2 days. And here let me make 2 points. First, this meeting today brings together a lot of people whose self-interest in being at this meeting was not necessarily altogether readily apparent before it was called. And it may serve as well as one place and one time where we can take a picture of open content in culture, education, and across media, and measure together, in discussions among people who do not always pool resources, what kind of successes we've had and what still needs to be done. Because different types of people are here today representing law, the academy, industry, government, and journalism, we have to be doubly sure that our conversations are free of jargon and our language, as I learned from my peril when I spent some time recently with Richard Stallman, whom we will hear from on video today, has to be as precise as possible. So our conversation today with that precise language will address, inter alia, the economics of knowledge as a public good, the economics of the public domain, in what is likely to be a spellbinding presentation from my friend and colleague David Pierce, the ways that consumers participate in the creation of mass media, and business and commercial interests in furthering open content. Sumir Meghani from Yahoo, among others, will outline a commercial position. But all told, our conversation is really about 3 things: collaborative productions, open content, and material that is available for free, with an emphasis on the cultural and educational environments. Collaborative approaches, open approaches, and what it means to be free. We are going to hear a lot of things that sound very counterintuitive at first. Part of that is what's so spectacular about the way Jim Sawicki writes. We're also going to hear things that we really want to believe are true. As our first speaker this morning, Paul Courant, an economist and professor of public policy and former provost at the University of Michigan, said to me when accepting this invitation to come, He wants so much for so much of this to be true that he's not sure if he can discuss it objectively. So to some degree, some of this may sound forced, because many of us want to believe certain things and want to make certain things happen. But be patient, because the proofs are coming too. And some of what we say or hear during these next 2 days may come out sounding right at first, and then, like a strange aftertaste, not sounding right. As when Ben Franklin reportedly argued that by being loyal to several women rather than to just one, he was in fact being more loyal. We will hear about different types of economy, a political economy. As Stephen Weber in The Success of Open Source put it, what would a broader vision of an open source political economy really look like? We will also hear about a moral economy. I think the key to the whole thing is what's contained in one of the books that MIT Press is promoting today. In short, that knowledge goods that have public social value need as much of our attention as they can get, and that there are serious alternative methods of collaboratively funding creativity that can be cost-effective. My friend Roy Rosenzweig, who could not be here today because he has to teach at George Mason, where he runs the Center for History and New Media, has written an article, Can History Be Open Source? History and the Wikipedia and the Future of the Past. It will be required reading, I think, for this crowd when it comes out in the Journal of American History this June. Roy will tell you that the popularity of Wikipedia, more than 1 million people a day visit the site. Alexa traffic rankings put it ahead of the New York Times, the Library of Congress, and far ahead of the Encyclopedia Britannica. It has almost 100,000 edits a day. That the principles of freedom and cooperation enshrined in Wikipedia make it the most important application of the principles of free and open software to the world of cultural production. An encyclopedia that offers, quote, a formidable challenge to Encyclopedia Britannica and Microsoft's Encarta in terms of coverage and accuracy, just as Linux offers a challenge to Microsoft. This process and the results are things that many of us will touch on today. Yochai Benkler with his presentation on social production tomorrow as well. Jimmy Wales from Wikipedia wanted very much to be here today, and it is my hope that in an appointment we have 1 week from today where we're supposed to discuss it, some video from this meeting can be one of the first video entries under open content in the Wikipedia. The second point is that I'm a documentary television producer now, but I've been involved in publishing and scholarly publishing in particular all my life. Publishing paid too well, which is why I went into documentaries. We now have the opportunity collectively to plan out and build in this vast laboratory of ours the next great stage of scholarly publishing, which will feature audio and which will feature the visual, and which I would like to propose we can kind of build collaboratively, self-aware as a group and self-conscious of the many pitfalls that have beset scholarly publishing to date, the structural challenges that by necessity have to flummox a communication system when it has to sustain over 100 university presses in the digital age and a half-dozen major textbook publishers in the age of Wikipedia. We will hear today and tomorrow from Anne Margulies, Steve Carson, and Shigeru Miyagawa, and others here about the incredible or maybe not so incredible numbers of people who come to MIT Open CourseWare for the video that is there. Video about what? Linear algebra, electricity, magnetism. We will hear and see from Victor Edmonds about the millions of users who come to UC Berkeley online for video, produced to explain astronomy and insect robotics. We'll hear from Frank Moretti and John Frankfurt at Columbia about tools that they have been developing that allow for online annotation and social interaction with video and with film. And we will hear from Marcia Kinder of USC about how USC's Annenberg Center is working on video alongside other experiential media to tell stories for students, for the public, and others about urban decay, Russian modernism, and Alzheimer's. And we will hear from Howard Besser at NYU and Jeff Uboyce and our friends at WGBH about new methods for archiving moving images that learn from the many and rich experiences of the Library of Congress, JSTOR, ArtStore, and Portico. And maybe before 115 university video presses start up to feed this monstrous demand for sound and light among students and teachers, or before Microsoft or the next Britannica get too far along in the video realm, we might have the opportunity to create a kind of distributed, collaborative video production network, a network that takes advantage of some of these amazing and often counterintuitive trends that we are here to talk about: openness, freeware, collaborative or commons-based peer production, a network that can serve education in a networked environment. That is what public broadcasting was meant to be, and it is the reason why MIT's former president, Jerome Wisner, was on the planning committee of public broadcasting 40 years ago. And it may well be the best way to save parts of that system from people who kind of attack the truth, like Fox Television, and what is even more challenging, to save it from our putative friends like Al Gore with Courant and Al Franklin with Air America, who are kind of missing the real source of energy for programming, which is the energy that is in this room. The great documentary filmmaker Peter Davis, who produced and directed perhaps the epitome of nonfiction art, the 1974 documentary on Vietnam called Hearts and Minds, once said that he produced films about topics where America's signature on its social contract with its people, for one reason or another, had been smudged. And I think we need to think about that today. And finally, it may be incumbent upon us, being that so many representatives from major foundations and government agencies are here, and here I'm grateful to the Rockefeller Foundation, Ford, Mellon, Hewlett, MacArthur, and Soros, all of which have senior program officers attending today, and to government agencies including IMLS, CHIN, and MLA in Washington, London, and Ottawa. It may be incumbent upon us to try in our presentations, in our conversations, to use this unique opportunity to help set forth some new ideas. And we have encouraged our panelists, and hope that everyone is part of this discussion, to put forward items for a new and improved research agenda, for a new and improved action agenda, for making more educational and cultural materials better and more widely available. So thank you very much. And with that, let me introduce Paul Courant. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Good morning, everyone. I look at the topic of this session and it says new models of creative production. I'm an economist and former bureaucrat, so creative production is something that I observe more than engage in. But having been a provost, almost all of the sets of activities, the scholarship and the money, have come and sat in my office at various times. And what I want to mostly talk about here, the mode of creative production I want to discuss, really is scholarship, which is the one that I probably care about most. And of course, the great thing about scholarship is, since it implicates absolutely all of both human and natural behavior, any other kind of creative production you want to put in underneath that rug works just fine. So, and scholarship, of course, must be fundamentally open. And technology changes it, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But broadly, scholars do two things. They write and they read, or listen or watch or get information some other way. They teach and they learn, which are the same things. And I have to admit I'm taking a fairly broad view of reading and writing here. But the first point I want to make, everybody knows this, and yet it's always worth saying, I think, is that scholarly work that is not made available in some medium where it can be shared with others is of no value. Not just a little bit of value, not just some value, none whatsoever. If you don't find the brilliant theorem until 2 generations after the mathematician is dead who left it in the attic, maybe it's still useful then, but it's unlikely to be. The publish or perish which we often talk about as being a terrible admonition that makes assistant professors get ulcers. Actually not. We've discovered that's bacteria now. But makes assistant professors seek Freud's mother in New York. Is actually a profoundly moral admonition, right? Things that are not published do perish, right? And therefore don't do us any good. If a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, nobody cares. So, to a first approximation, what this means, that what we do is we write stuff up and we put it in the library in a manner where others can find it reliably tomorrow and next year and 200 years from now. That's the deal that we're engaged in scholarship. Now, technology changes what we mean by the phrase write it up, changes what we mean by put it in, changes what we mean by library, and changes what we mean by find. But basically nothing important has been changed by technology in this enterprise. So, and scholarship fundamentally is about collaboration. Collaboration across time and collaboration across space. The coin of the realm, very much as in the case with the various other open content initiatives in all domains, is attribution. So I read or hear or see your stuff, I combine it with other stuff, I credit you with your work. And we have to note in passing, I think, that this is almost exactly the opposite of copyright, which doesn't require attribution for an idea that comes out of a conversation, but does require all sorts of other stuff that's quite irrelevant to what really matters in learning and teaching. And although, as we all know, those of us who've been in the academy, that there's any amount of pain and worse in the business of giving attribution, the fact is that most of us who are in the business think it works pretty well, and most of the time, and we like the work. So we now face what I think is a striking set of circumstances. The first is that information technology makes collaboration across time and space easier, far easier, than it has ever been. It allows all manner of people to comment and contend and revise and suggest. Wikipedia is a lovely example. Just the set of mechanisms that scholarship thrives on, but now with a potentially much higher level of activity and engagement. Writing it up and putting it somewhere, not quite the library always, which is another set of problems that we'll no doubt get to. Eventually it better make it into the library. But writing it up and putting it somewhere where it can be found and finding it is much easier technically than it's ever been, right? So that's unabashed, wow, is that good news? Let's go home, except it's too snowy. So what's getting in the way? At least a couple of things. One is the continuing notion, of course, of locking everything up because you might, or even could, make money from it. It's bad enough, even much worse than bad, that cultural expressions of all kinds, video, music, etc., can't be examined, recombined, even studied without all sorts of concerns about rights and payments getting in the way. So real artists, right, people who are genuinely, who are creative and trying to do culture, are blocked by each other and rights rules in all sorts of ways that are disastrous. If I were in the documentary film business, like my friend here, I would stick to very, very old subjects. Documentaries about Galileo look extremely promising. And I was talking with someone from WNET in New York. The marvelous show Eyes on the Prize that many of us watched on PBS a few years ago, nobody can see it anymore because the various rights of the various pieces are locked up for various pieces of time. They were only allowed for broadcast in the first place, so you really can't see it, right? You could try to make a fair use claim, except they'd be afraid to show it to you. And the broadcast rights were limited too. So here we have this cultural artifact, right? A very important one of an understanding of the understanding of a great set of moments in American history. It's not available to anybody. And that's a disaster both for direct scholarship and also for a broader cultural understanding of the society. We have students who assert intellectual property rights in their class projects. The business school is especially prone to this, not too surprisingly. There was a case at Michigan that I was involved in where a member of the medical school faculty had to meet with a bunch of others to sort out the intellectual property rights, again, on a student cross-disciplinary project and announced he was never going to work with undergraduates again. In addition to that being extremely annoying from the perspective of the chief academic officer, I had to say that his ideas had less intellectual, the ratio of intellect to property was the lowest of any of the ideas in the project. So at the same time that all of us here today, or most of us, are trying to work in an open way, there's a very powerful mentality out there that works the other way, and an extraordinary legitimacy accorded to that mentality, even among our students. I decided that I should read Steven Weber's book about open source. I went to Amazon. It's one of the books on Amazon where you can't even get a snippet. Right now, is that weird or what? And it's presumably because of the publisher. I can't imagine it's because of the author. So what's that about? Okay, back to the topic. The other problem limiting the scholarly value of these new technologies that should be so helpful is that the degree of cooperation necessary to facilitate the easy use and exchange of information and ideas is quite extraordinary. Once on a server somewhere, as we all know, work is available at essentially no additional cost, no marginal cost, everywhere. So exactly the same economic logic that tells us that competitive markets can produce efficient outcomes for private goods tells us that we want a social mechanism. We need a social mechanism, not a market mechanism, to produce public goods, goods that are public in this technical economic sense. Otherwise, what's missing, what we lose, is we prevent people who would obtain value at the cost of their own looking, so they can make that choice, from doing so. And there should be a pretty powerful rationale for such exclusion, right? Because it doesn't actually cost anything extra to let someone else take a peek. So if it's of even a tiny bit of value to lots of someone else's, lots of value is being thrown away if we charge for those peaks. Now, of course, there is the original incentive of creating work in the first place, and so hence the sense of something like copyright and patent and lots of other things. I don't want to object to people who have good ideas and create interesting things making some money. In scholarship, though, candidly, almost none of it is about money, right? And indeed, in commercial activity, the vast majority of material has little or no street value. One of my favorite facts about the world is that something between 95 and 97% of the material in the University of Michigan libraries that is protected by copyright is out of print, right? So it's really hard to believe that making it hard for people to copy this material, to look at this material, to use this material, to recombine this material is making anybody any money, right? Because actually so the answer is, okay, I won't copy it or look at it. I mean, but nobody's actually selling it for anything. And even university presses, and this is a serious problem, university presses which exist in support of scholarship are, many of them, totally getting it wrong about this. They're protecting their position as commercial entities when their fundamental purpose was not commercial. So if we're going to develop and continue to have effective mechanisms of scholarship in this world of where the marginal cost of shipping things out is approximately zero, we're obviously going to have to reconfigure ways in which we publish. This applies in the commercial sector, of course. It also applies in the quasi-commercial sector of the university presses. The general point I want to make here is that while open raises all sorts of interesting and difficult organizational problems and requirements for how we do things, of course, we know that. But we should start by recognizing that for a host of purposes, including our ability to study and communicate about our own cultural heritage and context, closed is broken, right? And that should provide some motivation for open. So the status quo is for things, if you can have a dynamic status quo, I think you can, just pick a derivative someplace. The status quo, sorry about the jargon, Peter. The status quo is for things to get worse and worse and worse unless we figure out how to do something about it. So let me go back to the public goods logic and pose it as a moral and scholarly imperative that we figure out how to make things easy to find digitally. Moral because it's possible and it has value in aggregate. This isn't, we can put a person on the moon, so why can't we make an automatic toaster that works? This is, we have a person on the moon with a video camera beaming pictures back to Earth, why can't we look at the pictures? right? And actually, in that case, because they're federal pictures, you can, but the metaphor still works. And the moral imperative is all the greater in the context of scholarship for at least two reasons. These tools allow collaboration of a kind that was heretofore impossible across shorter times and larger space, mixing text and images and huge data files, providing commentary, one could imagine, on archaeological digs as they are taking place. One can imagine that kind of collaboration across space. Developing collections of material, collections that feel just like collections, but that are not all in one place, but that can appear to be all in one place. All sorts of things that would make the craft of learning and teaching and of reading and writing much easier and more powerful. And NSF is actually putting some money into the notion of a collaboratory and of developing complete communities in some of the sciences based on the report on cyber infrastructure there. The humanities are much slower on that, but these opportunities are just extraordinarily rich, right? There's actually a moral imperative, I think, to take advantage of them. As Anne pointed out, they're not actually free. They cost money, and the mechanism of figuring out how to pay for them is extremely important. Selling is probably not it. Making material easily findable is imperative also because that which is not openly available will often not be found. So MIT just a few years ago said, okay, we're going to give it away. Actually, if you don't give it away, you might as well not even try to sell it because most of the people who could get use from it aren't going to. We have reasons, various reasons, even in libraries and universities for not giving it away. Those reasons range from very bad to at least somewhat justified. There's a business model out there that allows you to sell a little bit. But the vital consequence is that over time, the things that aren't easy to find won't be found at all. Our students get up in the morning, well, actually they get up in the early afternoon, and they go to their laptops and they search for whatever problem it is that they're searching for online. Guess what? So does the classics faculty. Right now, they still like getting into musty tomes, but actually they get up in the morning and fire up the laptop and start searching catalogs, card catalogs around the world, the equivalent of card catalogs around the world. So there's a very real possibility that for all kinds of reasons, that which is easiest to find will be that which is most found. Indeed, that will be the only stuff that is found. And for scholarly production to succeed in that environment, and indeed for social production to succeed in that environment, we'd better be sure that the things that are most valuable are the easiest to find. And actually, we're living in a world where that's not what we're sure of. Appropriate business and economic models to support openness of content are the subject of this conference. And I don't want to get ahead of the story, especially as I don't know how it comes out. Public goods problems of the kinds that I've sketched here are always difficult. Problems whose solution requires conscious cooperation are always harder than ones that can be solved through decentralized mechanisms, at least in the absence of dictatorship. And these are problems that will require extensive cooperation across lots of institutions. It used to make sense for universities to compete at the level of excellent library collections. It actually doesn't anymore, or it won't soon. And we love each other, we're all in it together, we love scholarship, we cooperate, and we like to compete. And so we're going to have to figure out different domains to do that in. There may be ways to use markets to solve some of these problems. I hope we'll hear about some over the next day or so. Part of a solution, however, of any solution, is a vigorous articulation of demand, both in markets and in public locales. We've got to get those kids who fire up the laptop and search to say loudly. We've got to get their parents to say loudly, we'd like to be able to find, everything, but that'd be cool, Dad. And then have a society that's actually willing to produce the findability of everything. The amount of money involved in producing the findability of everything, if you have a rational set of models, is actually not way bigger than the amount of money we spend now on producing the unfindability of lots of things. At least that's what I believe to be true. And here's where I get to the point where I wish that things were the way that I wish they are so much that I'm not sure I can be objective. So the model that people talk about in open content, the business model, if you will, is give it away, right, and then make money talking about it. Well, this is a professor's dream, right? Nobody buys what we sell, so that's cool, but we love to talk, and we get paid to do it. So if that world really works, and I think it may, right? a world in which we give it away and then we make the money by saying really wise, intelligent things about what it is that we've given away that make people say, wow, what a wise, intelligent thing you just said. That world is a much better world in a world where we lock it up before we talk about it. But I don't know what the answer is. This is an early session. I'm here as a cheerleader. The logic of public goods demands that we take advantage of zero marginal cost, even as we see it as a technical problem. And the logic of digital production, archiving, and distribution demand that we make sure that the good stuff is easy to find and use, or we risk, and this is the big risk, we risk building such understanding of the world as we have on whatever happens to be available instead of upon the best there is. Thank you.
What I want to tell you about in the next half hour brings this open content idea into physical goods. And what I want to show you is that there's a tremendous shift going on. What should I do? The mic. Okay. Okay, so I hope we have fun at this. This is a 6-hour talk in half an hour. So I'll skip every other word. Anyway, it's called Democratizing Innovation, and thanks to Ellen Farron, she'll talk about it later on. MIT Press has made this available for free on the web in addition to selling it. What I tell you about is really done by a number of people here. This is a very collaborative venture. And I am a reporter on it as well as a participant. So here's the basic idea. Traditionally, manufacturer-centered innovation was how we think of things. Manufacturers, after all, make a lot of money. There are a ton of people out there who want any particular thing that they produce, and therefore, it makes sense for them to develop it. So what am I going to do about the mic? So what is the pattern I see? I see that, in fact, can you give me what is that? Oh, cool. Okay, thank you. Descend. All right. So what is it that the traditional pattern does? It looks at the middle of the market. This is now the market. It looks at the middle of the market and it says, that's where the bulk of the consumers are. What we are going to do is ask you what you need. So marketers come around, you've seen them do it, and they look deep into your eyes and they say, you want rum-flavored toothpaste, do you? Then they go back into the lab and they develop it. So it's basically a find a need and fill it kind of a model. Now, I didn't believe that because when I was running a company as an entrepreneur, I never found any manufacturer listening to me at all. In fact, they usually said, buy what we have. And then I'd say, well, I can't really use what you have. And they said, well, alas, what you want is against the laws of nature. So I didn't really believe that, in fact, manufacturers had this link-side quality of understanding need. So what I began to do was to study with my students where innovations really came from. And what we saw was that they came very often, and as you see when it's functionally novel, almost always, they came from users at the leading edge. So what you saw was that some user would get into a huge jam, would innovate, and that would become, over time, picked up by other users, and then eventually a manufacturer would see a model and say, yes, well, that's something I can make money from. So what you have actually is a subdivision of labor that works out pretty well. Users innovate over here because they need it. Manufacturers do not like. By the end, I'll be in really good shape. Okay, and so users innovate at the front end. Manufacturers really don't like small and uncertain markets. So manufacturers sit there waiting for sort of mass demand, and then they begin to produce what it turns out users have developed. Now, how did we figure this out? We actually first began to look at where the major innovations came from over time in different fields. For example, scientific instruments. And what we did is we actually found the most important innovations over 20 or 30 years, and we went back and we tracked where each of these came from. And what we saw was a pattern, first, where manufacturers thought they did it, and secondly, really, that users had been the innovators. So, for example, detecting lead in blood, the level of sensitivity of a flame ionization spectrophotometer wasn't efficient or sufficient to do it at the time. So a user improved it. He then diffused to others how it worked. 5 to 7 years later, the manufacturer picked it up. Now, the manufacturer, however, ended up thinking, and here's the data on this, first device used and developed in the field, built by primarily users 80% of the time in scientific instruments. Part of the reason the manufacturer didn't understand that in fact the user was the innovator was it's not supposed to work like that. We have R&D people, we have marketing research, we go out looking for needs. And furthermore, the thing that the user develops doesn't look very cool. So this is a user-developed prototype. There's not even room to put HP in the corner. What kind of a product is that? Well, what you do when you innovate and when I innovate is you kludge something together. You put it together so that it does the function. And that's what we see in this field. Users put these things together. The manufacturer gets them in some sort of informal fashion. Maybe they do a field service trip and they say, oh my gosh, look at this, they've modified our product, and they come back in. It's sort of an underground process. As the manufacturer improves it over time, they forget these user roots. That's okay. There's enough credit to go around in life because everybody takes it. But the cost is that we don't understand where innovation comes from, so we can't go do the next. Now, there are many other examples of this. Center pivot irrigation, as you may know, when you fly across the country, these giant crop circles, as they were, are done by sprinklers. This is the first one, done by a user farmer. And as you can see, he took what was around. These are the old agricultural implement wheels from his tractor. This is the irrigation pipe he used to use. The innovation was the idea that the well is not the scarce resource. In fact, on many of these areas, you have aquifers 20 feet down or so. You can drill a well anywhere you want. So it's a much more efficient method than the previous one. Well, okay, so now once again, this is a modern version. You can see how much better it is, right? Cleaned up, glitzy. So I couldn't resist. This is by the Valmont company. So I called them up and I said, so who invented this marvelous device? You or someone else? I said, well, we did, my son. I said, did you get any input from users living or dead? And they said, certainly not. And when you send us a plaque, be sure to spell our names right. Well, so again, we have a misunderstanding here about where the important innovations come from. They often come from users. This is also true in case of personal products, mountain bikes, and so on and so forth. Strong pattern. Want to give you a definition now. The functional source of innovation is what I'm talking about. And innovation is a user innovation when the developer expects to benefit from using it. A manufacturer innovation when the developer expects to benefit from selling it. So it can be a user firm or a user individual. Thus, Boeing, when it makes an improved machine tool, is a user innovator because they expect to benefit from using that. When they make an improved airplane, that's a manufacturer innovation. They expect to benefit from manufacturing it. Okay? Now, users are not always the innovators. And I was most depressed at this because I thought, well, hell, I've discovered the Grail here. Turned out I only discovered half a Grail, possibly the bottom. Anyway, so here's scientific instruments that I told you about, and you can see here's the summary number, largely user. In other areas like engineering plastics, we found largely manufacturer innovators. And what we began to do was study the differences, because when you get strong distinctions like this, you can try to understand what variables are involved. And what we found, based on sticky information, and I'll jump over it, but based on the fact that information is local, the fact that you cannot very easily tell other people what you want, it turns out that users who are the ones who own, in a sense, or generate need information are the ones who develop the functionally novel innovations. They developed the first skateboard. Who knew a kid wanted to do that? As a manufacturer, they develop the first way to produce semiconductors. Only later do equipment firms come in. And later on, improvements along dimensions of merit are made by manufacturers. And this is also true for sports nutrition bars and everything else you see. Long before Power Bar came out there, people who were bike riders who were riding long distances were making up this kind of glop. And you know that, have you ever seen that gloppy quality of the Power Bar? You can sort of bend it and so on. That's because the first guy that did this bent it around his handlebars as a way to hold it so that he could pull off a piece at a time. Well, okay, so there's data on this. Now, users, again, tend to innovate at the leading edge of markets where demand is small and uncertain, so lead user innovations offer a feedstock for manufacturers. What I'll show you in a little while is that for this to work, you need the user content to be open. And also, for this to work, manufacturers have to understand where their innovations come from. Currently, as I said, they are focusing on the target market, asking them what they want. In fact, the innovations are coming from over here. Market research tends to regard those people as outliers. They don't buy much of our product. Why should we pay attention to what they're doing? The whole point is this whole thing is moving along over time like a rabbit through a python, to use a technical term. And so that what the users here want, because this is in fact a trend, what they want here will be wanted by the target market later. So we have a lead user definition, have needs that foreshadow general demand. That is, again, they are ahead on a trend that's important. And they have a high need. Necessity is the mother of invention. So now we see these people at the edge, but only some of them are the innovators. Those people who, in fact, have a high expectation of benefit. It's economically efficient because basically nobody is innovating here in expectation that others will want it. They are rationalizing their profit on the fact that they want it, and they know their needs very well. So there's data on this, and basically what you see, the round, large circles here show more attractive commercial innovations, and you can see that when the expected benefit goes up, there are more user innovations. When the expected position in the lead user trend goes up, these innovations are more commercially attractive. So example of a lead user innovation, the World Wide Web. Tim Berners-Lee was in CERN, a user organization. Networking of computers was extremely important there. It was ahead of the trend towards networking, so that was developed at CERN because the need was high there. Notice it was not developed at Microsoft. Just thought I'd mention it. Now, what do we find next? The next thing we find is, we've shown you so far that users develop the important innovations, the functionally novel ones. But it could be a rare event. Now what I want to show you is that, in fact, many users innovate. It's really quite stunning. When you get to people who care a lot about something, you find a high fraction of users innovating. So this is a study of surgical equipment. And basically, it's the users who do university-connected surgeons who are doing leading-edge operations. 20% of them develop and modify equipment. You look here, mountain biking equipment, 20% innovate. Now, this does not mean that if I go to the MIT bike racks, I will find 20% user home-built bikes. It is in the areas where people are pushing the sport, on the West Coast, Mount Tamalpais, and things like that. When you get into these enthusiast communities, you find a large fraction innovating, which is really, I think, cool, and leads directly to communities. What happens is users tend to form communities very quickly. Users tend to freely reveal. Now, this is, I should go back to that because that's the topic of this lecture, oddly enough. So empirical studies find innovating users often freely reveal their innovation. Why is this? It is because of a range of reasons that have been studied in open source software. Namely, if I freely reveal, you will improve it for me, you are more likely to use mine as a standard, and if that's a good thing, and so on and so forth. It's been seen in a whole range of industries, hardware as well as software. It's very important for user-centered innovation becoming a competitor, a viable competing system to manufacturer-centered innovation. Because if users freely reveal, the result is that every user does not have to invent again for his or herself. Instead, users can build a commons and, in fact, start to compete. And as I'll show you, they're out-competing manufacturers in a bit. Okay, so now, there are reasons. It's typically not practical. You've got to read the book. It's really free. But I discussed this in some detail there. That's another way to economize when you don't have enough time to. Anyway, so users tend to quickly form communities because they can share with each other. And we've studied this in all sorts of places like rodeo kayaking and things like that, physical products as well as consumer. And then what happens, it's an interesting cycle here. Then what happens is users in these communities start to ask each other, can you make one of those for me? Then what happens is some users, for example, in rodeo kayaking, they are making their own prototype kayaks. Somebody says, wow, that's a cool one. Will you build it for me? He says, okay, and he becomes a user manufacturer. It's very low capital kinds of manufacturing because he's doing the same kind of manufacturing he used to make his own prototype. Then, as the market stabilizes and gets bigger, manufacturers come in with higher volume kinds of production. So you see this sequence. Users innovate for themselves, they build for themselves. As volume begins to build, those people who understand the market deeply, because they're also users, tend to innovate. Then over time, manufacturers come in as the information about what's needed stabilizes and gets clearer. Okay, so now, user innovation communities can supplant, this is so cool, and this isn't physical stuff, can supplant manufacturer innovation. You know, the traditional history has been, this is production really. Manufacturers can produce more cheaply. It doesn't say anything about who can innovate more cheaply. So when we get into a field like this is about kite surfing. Now, kite surfing is something you all practice in your spare time, I am certain. And I knew nothing about it either until my students came along with it. But what it amounts to is it's a reverse parachute. You have sort of this thing that you go along the water, as sort of a small surfboard and quite light. And then you have a large arched kite. And you can use this thing to, in fact, fly into the air. You can go forward with the wind, against the wind, see all these wires here. They stabilize you, they enable you to steer, and so on and so forth. All this stuff was user-developed from zip. All these control systems, the kite, all the rest, all user-developed. Then what happened was manufacturers began to come in and produce this stuff and design it, and they each hired 2 or 3 engineers, and that was really cool. And they had masters in aerodynamics or whatever it was, because this is a slow-speed aerodynamical process that's not fully understood, and so there's some art to designing this thing as well as science. Well, then along came a guy named Saul Griffin, and he was a PhD until last year at MIT, and he did a lot of this kite surfing, and he said, you know, I'm going to start a website called zeroprestige.com, which is such a good one. What I'm going to do is share my designs, and then other people can pick up on these designs and share them too. The next thing that happened was that a lot of people joined on. And they were aerodynamicists at NASA and, you know, aerodynamics kids from all around the known universe and so on and so forth. And what they began to do, they put on tools that were much better than the tools that existed for the manufacturers. This is all little vortices now that you're modeling on these kites. They began to post their designs. First they post their designs as physical things. Now they post them as CAD files because they've learned that laser cutters in sail lofts can actually cut out what you want, and you can make the pieces and put together your kite much more cheaply than a manufacturer can. In any case, now what started to happen was this worldwide community could post these designs. Everybody could get it produced the next week in their local laser cutter. They could model it, they could play, they could report back their findings. And they began to drive the manufacturers back out of product design because they were in aggregate, free-revealing and in aggregate had better, more information. So the manufacturers began to get driven back to producing designs rather than designing them. Manufacturing rather than designing them. This is a pattern that's been in other areas too. It is, for example, pioneered in the area of integrated circuits. In integrated circuits now, most of the circuits are designed by users and manufactured by what's called silicon foundries. Okay, now, here we are in this struggle of manufacturers to figure this out. It is so interesting because what's happening here is that business models really have to change. Oh my God is the usual response. So here we have Lego, which is so cool, Lego Mindstorms. And now Lego Mindstorms was developed in part at MIT and in part over 7 years with 10 engineers at Lego. That's a lot of time. 70 engineer years. And what it is it has little circuits in it and so on. It's bricks, Lego bricks, but in them they might have sensors in them or a CPU and so on. And you can actually, in little motors, you can build a robot. Your kids might have done it. You might have done it. They introduced it with great pride, having gotten it right over many, many, many years. It was made for kids 8 to 13. Within 3 weeks of introduction, 1,000 hackers were working on it. They vastly improved it. They instantly cracked the code. They vastly improved it. They began to publish on the web what they had done. They began to annoy Lego no end because this is a kind of a track the robot can follow, because they started to demonstrating within 3 weeks, you know what, we do it in 10 seconds, the Lego company does it in 25, and so on and so forth, and saying, we are really cool about this whole thing. Well, this was stunning, and the Lego company, poor people, made a lot more money than they expected. 70% of the customers were not who they expected. They were over age 18. It became a craze among techie adults. Silicon Valley firms forced to ban Legos at work. Lego unable to keep them in demand and so on. Major university built curricula around Lego, including MIT, sort of primitive robotics kinds of things. Now, what did Lego do about this? Nothing. They did not know what to do. They sat there. There's almost a full year without a word from Lego, neither acknowledgments of what was going on, nor threats toward the hackers. Lego executives simply didn't know what to do. Well, now, how would they know what to do? Their job is to find a need and fill it. And these damn users, what are they doing? So I've got to tell you, it's so cool. I was at a meeting of a car company in Europe, and they were presenting their 10-year plan, and they were like this, and it was really cool and good. They were presenting their 10-year plan to auto enthusiasts and also auto journalists. After a while, the people in the audience got restive, and one kid raised his hand and said, you know, you're talking about what you're going to do in the next 10 years. We've already done all that. Come out into the parking lot and see what we've developed. And the engineers were just totally, what do we do now? You know, they were just totally. So finally, the guy in charge crossed his arms like this. I thought it was so wonderful. Crossed his arms like this and said, you have not? And I said, what do you mean we haven't come out to the parking lot? He said, you have not, because that's not what we had in mind, which I thought was really good. So there is huge pain involved in trying to figure this out. Today, Lego is starting to learn how. They are, for instance, now they have involved top innovators from the adult fans of Lego to make their new Lego 2, Next Mindstorms robotic product. They adopt key existing adult fans of Lego, this is, innovations. They asked a few AFOL people to join the team. But it's absolutely fascinating. You know, they don't know how to do it yet. The first thing that happens, if you have an innovating group, the first thing that happens if a manufacturer looks at them at all, they come along and they take the top people and they say, we're going to give you a really cool T-shirt. Don't talk to anybody else anymore. You know? And if somebody else good comes off, they chop those too. It's sort of amazing. But anyway, so they don't understand the principles yet of collaborative design. But they are doing something, and they're also trying to hook to their fans and so on and so forth. Now, I have got 6 minutes left. Okay. So what are the implications of user-centered innovation for firms? They have to figure out what to do. Right now, the paradigm, presently, the manufacturer-based paradigm is badly broken. 75% of products break, fail, are not successful in the marketplace. Can you imagine in sort of the zero defects manufacturing environment if your machine only worked on Thursdays? Well, that is what the innovation process is like right now. And if you shift, what you find, this is a study we did, a controlled study where you got information from lead users. It's sort of like an FDA study, comparison of non-lead and lead. We did it at 3M. Standard teams and all the rest of it, standard techniques. The annual sales of the products developed by lead users and picked up by firms was 8 times higher than the annual sales of a comparison group. So the point is, you don't find orders of magnitude lying around every day. You know, it might be because the system isn't designed the way innovation actually works. People tend to design their innovations systems around the way they think it works. The conventional wisdom is wrong, and what's happening here is that user innovation is coming in. Well, there are other things to tell you about, but policy implications, research needed. You know, basically, user innovation is increasing as computing and communication costs drop. People have heterogeneous needs. They are able to find each other. They are able to innovate. They are able to build. User-centered innovation increases social welfare. We did a study on this. So it's a good thing. At least it should not be discriminated against by government policymakers. So R&D centers, R&D strategies now are essentially technology push. We will develop new technologies to do things, wonder what we need. What we need now is sort of a user-centered need pull strategy as a complement. And we have to understand how this works. It's fascinating because this is a fundamental change in the social division of labor. Basically, a lot of stuff has to be rethought. Now, user-centered innovation is distributed rather than centralized and commonly involves free revealing. We must learn to support the innovation commons. You wouldn't argue with me there, I'm sure. I want to tell you something, though, but we have to study what we mean by the innovation commons. Just finished this last week with somebody named M. Fauchard from France. This is about invisible fences that might be across what we think is the innovation commons. It's so cool. We did a study of French chefs. M is French. And so, of course, we decided to really do our research right, so they're all 3-star chefs. And what we saw was novel recipes are not protected by law-based IP. So are they automatically in the commons? No. Basically, there are norms. It's so cool. There are norms that exist within these communities which act like IP. So when we try to understand what we're doing here in terms of open revealing and open sharing, we have to be aware of these fences that may crisscross the commons. In this case, thou shalt not copy my recipe exactly is a norm. And if you do, there are sanctions. And I would say it in a French accent, but I'd mess it up. If another chef copies a recipe exactly, we are very furious. We will not talk to this chef anymore, and we won't communicate information to him in the future. And what we did is we quantitatively measured this, and we found that, in fact, they were less likely to share information with people who did not adhere to the norms. So it's a fascinating kind of a new area. Once we decide that the area of open commons and open revealing is very important, we have to understand what openness means and how it works and so on and so forth. And there are all these interesting areas and things to do. Now, because information is sticky, well, I don't have time to do that for you, I think. Well, I got to show you. Basically, another item here is that user innovation is heterogeneous. It's spread out. It's distributed. So one of the key points here, when we look at our data, what we see is not that there is a genius user doing it all. What we see is that, in fact, most users produce one big innovation. So that when you are, in fact, designing a new system to pick up user innovations, you have to understand that. It's distributed. You can't just acquire a user and be in business. And here's a wonderful example, just so it's so cool. You ever use this thing, Camback? It's a water thing. It's called a hydration system. They used to be called canteens, you understand. But anyway, and this thing has a pack of water in the top. And basically, it's sold to U.S. troops and all sorts of people. Now, where did that come from? It came from a user, but that user was a user who was uniquely positioned to innovate in this way because he had both the need and the solution in hand. This user, this is now a bag, and this is the hose that you drink through. It's much better. He was a bike racer. I don't know if you've all, in your bike racing days, you remember how you had to reach down and pick up that canteen thing that was hooked onto the frame, and then you had to sort of pull it off, and if you didn't get it on right, it would drop onto the road, and it was, well, so this is much better. You just suck on this thing. Well, who developed it? Personal hydration system invented by a Texas paramedic, Michael Edison, to prevent dehydration during a summer bike race. He fashioned a drinking system from surgical tubing and an IV bag that he sewed to his shirt. He took it out of his truck. These are IV bags. He knew about the solution, took it out of his truck. This is the tube he used. He sewed it to his shirt. He had the need because he was, in fact, in a summer bike race. And this is how these things come about. So, again, it's not that we have a concentration of expertise that we can know in advance. We have to understand how to do this distributed stuff. It's going to be an evolving, competing thing. It's so cool. And in Denmark, not that we know anything about it yet, in Denmark, they have now made a national policy that they are going to push user-centered innovation. And I asked them why this was, and now we're helping them with it. And why this was, they said because other people are focused on technology, and we can never hope to catch up. But we, in fact, tend to be more sensitive to user needs. I don't know if that's true or not. And so we have a comparative advantage there. So we're doing a big program there for academic and industry and so on to do that. So that's the news. Thanks.
Stand right here, and you want the lab mic?
Go ahead, give me the mic. I'm sure.
Okay. He's going to snag that from him. Just a second.
Okay. There you go.
Okay. You're all set.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to begin. And I want to begin by telling you a little bit about who I am and why I'm doing this. Most of you in the audience don't know me. I'm a full-time activist and a part-time academic. I believe that a new mode of production of information is emerging in our society. I call it collaborative production. You've heard those words before. I believe it is much more consumer-friendly and citizen-friendly than the incumbent regime. But regime change in technology is violent. I wish the only thing they did was give you a T-shirt and ask you not to talk about it. In fact, they'll tell you not to do it or you go to jail. The incumbents will resist in court cases, regulatory policy, legislation, which is the brass-knuckle world where I spend most of my time. In fact, the Consumer Federation of America, I'm very proud to say, is the only public interest group to have been officially involved in every one of the major cases, with one exception of the recent past decade. Portland versus AT&T, Brand X, Grokster, Microsoft, Broadcast Flag, Prometheus. We actually fight in those realms. To effectuate change, which I believe is good for consumers and citizens, I practice political economy in the classic sense. The Dictionary of Modern Economics suggests that political economy, quote, has connotation of the interrelationship between practical aspects of political action and the pure theory of economics. It goes on to point out that, quote, it is sometimes argued that classic political economy was concerned more with this aspect of economy and that modern economics have tended to be more restricted in their views. I am concerned about both political action and economic analysis. As an academic, I want to understand this new mode of production, and I'm going to wrap a lot of theory to explain, and you'll hear me mention von Hippel and David Reed and a variety of people. I'm going to wrap a theory around it to explain it in terms that people can understand, that's closer to their realm of experience, so that I can mobilize them in political action to create this positive change for our society. Now, I take a structural view of industrial organization, something famous down the road here at Harvard, and an institutional view of economics. Structural analysis teaches us that when the basic conditions of production change, structure and conduct will also change. Institutional economics focuses on what Douglas North calls the endless struggle of human beings to solve the problems of cooperation so that they can reap the advantages not only of technology, but also of all the other facets of human endeavor that constitute civilization. A very broad view of economics. So I start from a familiar set of economic concepts, arguing that economic analysis has long recognized that under certain conditions, competitive markets do not produce socially desirable outcomes. I know this because my daughter's Economic 101 textbook used these very terms at great length. So I clearly know that this exists in our society because they teach it to all those kids going to college. In the case of public goods and externalities, the problem is not a lack of competition, which we all love, but the inability of profit-driven enterprises and transactions to produce the goods or capture the value that benefit society best. These market failures occur where goods lack the critical characteristics that make private market property-based transactions work. And in the neoclassical paradigm, I'll give one paragraph. I assume everyone has been taught that in there in school. Scarcity is about rivalry, and property is about exclusion. The central claim for the superiority of a property regime is that where resources are rival or subtractable, efficiency requires that they be devoted to their highest value uses, which is what market allocation does. Exclusion gives the owner of the resource the incentive to husband it and develop it, especially where investment is necessary to replenish it. Those are the conditions under which private property works. Now, when rivalry and excludability break down, the provision of private goods also becomes problematic. Non-rivalry occurs where consumption by one person does not diminish consumption by another, and therefore there's no reason to allocate it, since it's not consumed. Excludability may break down where you can't keep people out, so there's no reason to invest. Why? Because you can't charge the free riders and recover your investment. As a result, we get these various forms of non-private goods. But I argue that under the current conditions of digital production, we must extend these concepts. I want to talk about anti-rivalry and inclusiveness. Anti-rivalry is a situation where sharing increases the amount or value of the good available to others. Von Hippel has shown that with free revealing. Inclusiveness is a situation in which the value of the good increases as the number of people using it increases. Now, I locate these on these standard dimensions so that everyone in college who's heard this might be able to expand their horizon and see something different. So, moving away from private goods in the rivalry dimension, we move from high rivalry, where consumption by one diminishes consumption by another, to low rivalry, where it does not subtract, to the opposite effect, anti-rivalry, where use by one increases the ability of another to use it. Moving away from private goods in the excludability dimension, we go from keeping people out, which is easy, to keeping people out, which is hard, to the opposite effect, inclusiveness, the benefit of pulling people in. This is a simple concept, hopefully. Now, anti-rivalry and exclusiveness or inclusiveness do not operate for all goods under all circumstances. I suggest that in the three areas I am studying, open spectrum, open source, and peer-to-peer networks, it is uniquely suited. These are uniquely powerful events, forces it. Each of these benefits from a variety of economic advantages along key dimensions in a digital environment. And that's absolutely critical because computing intelligence can be distributed widely and activities at the endpoints can be communicated almost costlessly. Interactivity is transformed. Users become very close to producers because they all have this ability. The ability to embed logic in hardware and knowledge in software makes the transfer of knowledge very, very easy. And so the digital communications platform transforms the fundamental process of innovation. In each of these cases, I identify in the paper a specific resource that is saved, spectrum, code, storage, bandwidth, content, a cooperation process that enhances the production function, and the benefit to those people participating in those activities. The larger the benefits, the lower the costs. The easier to communicate, the more likely is collaboration. David Reed of MIT has offered the clearest example of this in what he calls repeating networks. This is for open wireless mesh networks. When devices help each other and act as repeaters, sharing and supporting communications between neighboring points, the total capacity of the system expands and the cost of producing communications declines dramatically. This is his curve for the open wireless spectrum. What I have done in the other two areas is look for the specific production function that gives me the equivalent of this curve. And so in the case of open software, the sharing of rich information deeply affects the production process. The environment of near zero costs allows people to share information. With this a vast array of diverse individuals available to address complex problems, the possibility we will find someone with a solution somewhere is increased. As long as we keep communications open, they will share the solution. We will avoid redundancy. And so the rapid, ubiquitous spread of answers to these difficult problems in diverse environments is enhanced. Effective, efficient problem solving is possible, but only if the tasks, the efforts, and the results are shared. Much the same has happened in peer-to-peer networks. Hardware and communications costs declined dramatically, capacity increased, PCs became these incredibly powerful things, and the central servers and the backbones became the bottlenecks. Those are where the costs now reside. And so the design principle of the Internet made it inevitable that users would find software solutions to escape these central server bottlenecks, what some people have called the hub and choke points in the network. By building multiple level connectivity, by sharing these resources, we actually expand the carrying capacity of peer-to-peer networks. Exactly the same principle across these three areas. All of these areas benefit from transaction costs. Von Hippel has shown you exactly why. When producers become close to consumers, at the end, when consumers become the producers, we eliminate all these transaction costs, these difficulties of transferring knowledge and transferring identifying needs. It's always more efficient for someone to solve their own problem, depending upon the resources they have available. But there's also a benefit on the demand side, and this is extremely important, and he mentioned the basic idea as well. The value of networks inheres in the number of connections that can be made and the possibilities for communications that they open up. And this is, again, another graph from David Reed. He identifies three different kinds of networks, and he calculates the expanding capacity of that network given certain types of communications, and he discovered what exponentiation. Exponentiations mean that anyone can talk to anyone, and that creates tremendous potential. But some people have argued that what will happen is that the ability of people to maintain those communications will be overwhelmed. So the exponent grows too quickly. But it turns out even if you do a cube, that is, even if you only do 3 by 3s, you get an immense increase in capacity. So I'm not concerned about the extreme. But here's the key point. And that wasn't in the paper, and sort of figuring out how to do this in 20 minutes really helps you clarify your mind, right? So this is the key sentence. The key is that you cannot predict or restrict which subgroups will form. You can't guess it. To capture the value of group-forming networks, you must give the members of the network the freedom to self-organize. The minute you try and guess who's going to do what with whom, you've introduced an inefficiency. You have to let them self-organize. And interestingly, what do we discover about the essence of ad hoc wireless mesh networks? They depend on group formation in precisely this fashion. They allow the mobile nodes to enter and leave the network at will. They design their system to deal with the nodes that are available. They bring this new capability, and I quote from David Sichter at Columbia. They create a form of self-configuring wireless networking in which connections are transient and formed in an ad hoc, as-needed basis that enables self-healing networking in which routing continues in the face of broken nodes or connections. It's that free formation of networks that's crucial. In open source, the peer group is at the heart of the movement. The ability to discuss, critique, sharing values. Whoever wants to participate can. Exactly this precise notion of self-organizing groups. The demand side of peer-to-peer looks exactly the same. Individuals are allowed to engage in exchange as they see fit. They engage in viral communications. It's a very popular word these days, which is exactly what the center does not know. The Dean campaign famously discovered that people came to their website and they started to talking not to the Dean campaign, but to their neighbors. Viral communications. And collaboration, anonymous, co-production. It goes on out there in self-forming networks. When we combine the supply curve and the demand curve, and David Reed did not do this, and so I take responsibility for any of the mistakes here, we arrive at a very different level and point of production. Output expands dramatically to where total capacity is exhausted because individuals are making these participatory decisions. We have decentralized these decisions to participate in collaboratives, collectives. So we've changed the fundamental dynamic. I would argue that the introduction of market transactions based on property claims at any of the key points reduces output. It would raise transaction costs, it would restrict the options, or it would undermine the willingness to share, which lowers the cost and increases the value of the product. So in a certain sense, I have a part of the answer to the question of how do we pay for things we want to give away for free. Because the answer is that if you tell people you're only going to give them away for free, if you design the structure that way, you dramatically reduce the cost and increase the value. You close the gap. That doesn't mean you still don't need resources, but the cost of producing and distributing those things you promised to give away for free will be much lower, and your resource problem will be much smaller. So this framework can lead in a number of directions. I think analytically, I want to study collaborative production a lot more. The interesting thing is I can also go into physical space and study other areas where non-commodified, non-property governance rules have predominated. Cooperatives have existed in physical space. Common pool resources. Human beings have been managing these resources for centuries. So there are solutions, and we can learn a lot from that. Practically, hopefully by identifying an accumulation principle, the practitioners will be better able to exploit their advantage. Politically, we identify specific policies to promote collaborative production. Open spectrum, open networks, intellectual property rights that allow sharing. And we also can better demonstrate the harm that would be imposed upon us if they win in those court cases. And the irony of all 6 of those court cases I gave you is that we were on the winning side at the appeals court level. Unfortunately, in either settlement in the case of Microsoft or at the Supreme Court level, we were reversed. But there is a base. The fact that we won at the appeals court level is encouraging. But ultimately, we end up back in Congress. But let me close by looking at a broader picture, and it came up a bit at the end of a previous talk. In order to succeed, a political economy must rest on more than just technology and economics. It must also institutionalize itself across other dimensions of society. It is to the credit of the open source movement that it always understood the importance of articulating a coherent, citizen-friendly, consumer and producer-friendly political economy in a belief system and a political credo that gave it a coherent set of values. In fact, part of the problem in unlicensed spectrum and peer-to-peer networks is we haven't had this real activist political leadership. We've been scrambling around, and the other side has been able to define the terms of the debate. So it's all about piracy, right, or privatizing the spectrum. So we do need this political leadership. On the other hand, it is easy to see how a coherent political economy would be defined across all these dimensions, about how inhabitants of space and cyberspace, consumers and producers, people in civil society, citizens and speakers in the polity could be coalesced around a set of values, very much the values expressed in the open source movement. As I said, I'm not an academic, and I want to thank the organizers of the conference tremendously for giving me this opportunity. I encourage you. I put the particulars up there. I don't get a lot of peer-reviewed feedback from the academics and other folks. Contact me. Every time someone tells me, pushes this set of definitions, they get a little better. And so, please, there's a long paper on the spectrum, which I've already given, which goes in a lot of details. The open source paper and the peer-to-peer networks paper will be out over the next few months. I thank you.